Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stephanie Michelle, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Steph. When are you going to come to the UK, Steph?
It's on my radar.
Yeah.
Maybe this winter.
Yeah. Well, when you do, we're going to do an in-person event, because we really want to meet people in person, don't we?
You're just shouting it out? Yeah, we do.
Because if you're listening, okay, we haven't set a date at the moment. Maybe we will have by the time this comes out. But if you're interested, send us a message on the Life After Diets podcast.com website. And we will add you to the interested list and let you know. And if you're a member of our community, you will get a heavily discounted rate, no doubt. So that's also an incentive to sign up and join our community. They'll get first dibs on tickets anyway.
I'm thinking like what, January?
Yes, probably looking
Like
at January. Yeah. So none of this January dieting. Come hang out with us instead in January.
That's a good one. That's a good title of our event. This week is the second in a two-parter. So last week we spoke about fear of hunger and fear of getting hungry. And this week we're talking about fear of fullness, or being full, or being triggered by the sensation of fullness.
Yes. And my first foray into the dieting world was a hypnosis. And the idea was that you ate when you were hungry, and you stopped kind of when you weren't hungry, as opposed to when you were full. So my first form of any type of restriction, that I didn't see it as such because I thought it was just the most sensible thing I'd ever heard, was immediately demonizing this idea of fullness. If you're full, you've eaten too much. And I think I carried that for the longest time, that anytime I felt full, I thought I must have eaten too much. And of course, the fullness was so associated with binge eating as well.
Well, I think that's pretty common as far as the demonization of. I think that it's really normal to be like, fullness is bad, and that you want to stop short of that. I know that, I've heard the explicit direction to go to bed hungry, right? Like going to bed full is like a no-no. Getting full is a sign that you've had too much, rather than a sign of satiation. Or to me, fullness is kind of the only way I can really feel done. I think we talked in a couple of weeks back about how do you know that you're done or that you're satisfied. And it's like sort of like sitting back in your chair, like, yeah, that's in my stomach and it's there and I can feel that it's there. But I'm not talking about feeling over fullness, but definitely a sensation of fullness rather than an absence of hunger.
Only last night when I was sitting down for dinner, I realized I was really hungry. And when I thought back about what I'd eaten, I thought, oh gosh, I really haven't eaten enough today. And dinner was spaghetti bolognese, which is a pretty kind of substantial meal. And I was really excited about it as well. So I dished myself up a big portion. And I remember looking at it and thinking, I'm probably going to feel a bit uncomfortable after this, but I don't care. I'm hungry and I'm ready for it. And it's absolutely fine. I'm almost looking forward to that really full feeling. And as I was eating it, I was so conscious of eating it really joyfully. So I'm joyfully eating this spaghetti bolognese. And I get to the end of it and I'm like, wow, I didn't actually feel uncomfortably full. And I genuinely think, I don't have evidence for this, my subjective experience, I genuinely think that the emotional state that I was in when I ate it, that full acceptance, that looking forward to it, that enjoying it, although I could really feel the fullness in my stomach, really stopped from that, that really heavy, uncomfortable fullness. I think it's possible to have felt that, but I think because I was just so happy about eating that I couldn't feel that because I was too happy to feel that. Does that make sense?
It does. Because I talk about the filters in your mind where you have sensory input, and there's a filter in your brain that interprets that sensation. And I think oftentimes we're like, oh, like now or it's associated with binges, right? So you're like, now I've gone and blown it. Now here's my binge. It started, and it's being interpreted in your mind as bad or whatever the story is. And your story and your filter was positive. So it's not connecting to your brain in the same way. It's actually processing through a different neuron network, even if the input was originally the same.
Yes. But before that feeling of fullness was so associated with guilt and exactly that idea that I've blown it. Because every day this plan I had of how I was gonna eat was this really light way of eating, I think is the way
Yeah.
to describe it. And I reasoned it off that it's okay to eat light because that just gives me more energy when I'm not feeling so full all the time.
Yeah.
But really, well, we know the story. Wasn't enough. Binging continued. The end.
Well, I mean, I might be belaboring the point here, but you know how, are you someone who likes thrill rides or roller coasters?
Yes, very much
Oh,
so.
okay, good. Then you feed right into my story here. I don't know how I would have done it if you didn't. But the drop sensation, right? Or the speed, that sensation when you're on a roller coaster, if it's something that you like to do, is like, yes, this is fun. That same sensation in the middle of a dream or like the middle of the night is fear. It's like a nightmare kind of thing. Or when you're feeling sick, and you know that you've got a stomach bug, that same sensation is going to be bad. And we make the story, we build the story, and we confirm the bias around that, or good, depending on the context. And I think that that is part of reassigning stories to fullness, that you can take that same sensation and depending on how the light you're putting it under, that it will be perceived to you and communicated back to you in a different way. Whereas before, it only meant you have done it again, and you might as well keep going because this is just the beginning. That's all that fullness ever meant to me. So it I'm not saying that like, oh, just change your mind and you change it. It's like, yes, associations have to be built, but they can be built, I think is the point.
And as we know, diet culture really demonizes the idea of fullness and the guilt that comes. For me, I think of guilt as a heavy burden. It's that heavy emotion. How do you experience guilt in your body? Do you know?
Um, my head goes down, like physically. Yeah, my head wants to go down, and there's something in my chest and towards my stomach, but it's like the front of me has this hollowness and a little bit of a, oh gosh, how could I describe it? Like the way that when you're boiling pasta water and it starts to it's going to overflow, like and it bubbles, that kind of thing happens in my chest.
Mm. Gosh, it's so interesting because so for me, guilt feels more like a stone in my
I think,
stomach.
yeah, I think we've talked about this. Yeah, it is different for us.
So I was thinking, one, there's the beliefs, I suppose, around fullness that create guilt. But maybe for those of us who experience guilt in our stomach anyway, as a heaviness in our stomach, that fullness, just the feeling of fullness, could be similar to some people's physical experience of guilt,
Mm,
which makes them really kind of intertwined because it's being reinforced cognitively, and your body is also experiencing these two things in a kind of similar way, like in your example with the roller coaster and in a dream. I'd never thought of that before.
but also how it also intersects with if the guilt is living in your stomach and it starts with that fullness. And then it's like, I don't want to feel that. So I need to push that down. And then food further pushes it. To even if you're talking about the torso, it's still that front part of the body. To me, food is like override that, like numb that out, which is an interesting way to look at it from that
Mm.
physical point of view.
Yeah, because if you were talking about it like a bubbling up, the
Yeah.
food is that kind of pushing down of that.
Yeah. 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 It soothes that down. So the instinct could be to even eat even more. Again, this goes back to in our conversation last week. It doesn't make sense in your mind. Why would I eat more when I feel guilty about eating? It doesn't make rational sense. But your body is like, well, because there's bubbles and there's heaviness and like, get this away from me. Food actually makes that quell. So there is sense in it when we're looking at it from when we give validation to the body's point of view.
I think there was also something for me with fullness. Let's say, I had gone out for a meal and I was full, and leaving the meal would often be a time where I might get binge foods on the way home. That idea of being full and that meaning that I can't eat until tomorrow, for me, was almost experienced this sort of deprivation sense. I'm full, so that means in my mind I should stop. That should stop makes me think, "No, I wanna carry on." It's this real sort of rebellious
Mm-hmm.
pushback, and that rebellion that came from fullness and feeling like fullness meant, "Oh, I'm supposed to stop." Yet if there's no supposed to stop when I'm full, I just want to. It's that really weird kind of mind switch that I think happens in recovery.
Yeah.
It turns that
I
around.
that's a I think that's one of a pivotal point to bring up around fullness. It to me is like the more full you are, the farther away your next meal should be, is perceived to be. And that is the biggest disappointment and sadness when food is your thing. It's kind of like the fuller I am, the more I'm pushing off when I deserve my next bout of eating. And I think that that is triggering. And again, it can trigger that the should part, which is like, well, then I'm just going to keep going. The rebellion in that and the grief in that together. I think that was a huge factor in fullness as a sensation to me and what that meant. And it never even crossed my mind that it was okay. Like I didn't have to wait to be hungry for it just wasn't allowed. It wasn't the right thing to do in theory, even though every single day I was always eating. It never ended up that I was waiting till I was hungry. Anyway, I was binging every single day at one point. But in my mind, that was not what should have been happening. So it didn't matter what was really happening or what could have been allowed, making no difference in the end. But that this idea of what should be was so powerful that it would influence my eating in that moment.
Yeah. I think it was as simple in my mind as if I'm full, that means, well, I should only eat when I'm hungry. So therefore, if I'm full, that means I can't. And also, the only times that I ate when I wasn't hungry during those years always felt compulsive because it was always a battle. So the permission wasn't there. So then it was just always this sense of, well, it didn't make sense for me to not eat if I'm not hungry. I'd be like, if there's no hunger to satisfy, food's never going to feel okay. I'm always going to feel like I need to keep eating it and keep eating it.
Mhm.
And I've shared this, I think, in one of the early episodes, that it's so clear in my mind this one time where, my last couple of years, probably when I was still binging, but perhaps a bit less so, when I'd gone for a hot breakfast on my break and I was walking back to work and I could feel that fullness of my breakfast, this hot food that I'd had in my stomach, and thinking, it actually feels quite nice. And I
Mhm.
hadn't thought that for years. There was a sense of the food in my stomach is going to keep me going. And that was just a really pleasant experience to have. And it was a new thought. It was a thought that I hadn't had for a really long time. That was a shift for me as well. Felt like a really pivotal moment.
And I can appreciate why that would be a really hard. I think that that's like a place you can get to when food isn't constantly associated with overfilling. I think knowing that was a later stage of recovery for me to be able to feel fullness and feel glad about it, because there wasn't also this feeling of now I'm going to overfill, and it's always this state. It's always this uncomfortable sensation. And speaking of that, I think another reason that fullness can be triggering is because I've mentioned this before. There was this, how there's part of eating to me that said like I'm here, like that the groundedness in my body that it would give me. There is this like window where that feels true, and that's I think how fullness works now, where it's like I feel very present. But if you have a really uncomfortable relationship with your body, overfilling makes you concentrate on it. It's like you can't escape that physical sensation of my body is here. My body exists and I feel it and I can't escape from it. And when I, hated my body and hated myself because of my body, being full was like prolonging the agony of being with my body, because you can't move away from it when you're that full, like to the point where you're crawling in bed. I mean, I know that this isn't true necessarily for every listener, but I got to the point where sometimes I'd be so full that I would have to lay down and just wait for some space to be made in there. And there was nothing I could do except be with that discomfort. I couldn't really think about even anything else. And it was just me and my darn body, and it was like, to me, that was so triggering. It was so, because I was powerless to escape it at that point. And then I'd be like, well, you did it to yourself. There was so much run around in that conversation in my mind. But I think that fullness can be a way that you're forced to be with your body. And depending on the relationship you have with your body, that can be extremely triggering.
If you want connection and support around any of the topics we talk about on the podcast, we would love for you to join our membership community.
Members have access to monthly online support groups, a private Facebook group, live episode recordings, and member-only Q&As.
If you would like to join us, please head to lifeafterdietspodcast.com/community.
Now let's get back to the episode.
How do you talk about that experience of when you're going into a binge and the binge has begun, and maybe you've already eaten a lot of food, maybe you're already fairly full when you started, but while you're binging, there's like no sensation of fullness.
Yeah.
You're eating and it doesn't feel like you're full. It feels like this bottomless pit. Sometimes my brain might have been a little switched on. Sometimes it was completely gone. When it was a little switched on, there was this kind of idea of how the hell am I putting this amount of food into my body? And I'm not even feeling unwell. And then it would usually be a case that the food would end and then bam,
Yes.
like a punch, like it's just almost like it all suddenly arrives at the same time. And now I can hardly breathe.
Yes. That's extreme hunger, though. And to me, that was another area where I would pathologize. So I'd be like, when I was eating in that bottomless pit where you just keep putting food in and it's like, how am I doing this? Like, but that wasn't triggering to me because I wasn't feeling full. And I truly, it was like my brain understood that I'd probably regret it later. But because I wasn't getting the reflection back from my body that it was full, it felt right. It was like, no, this isn't triggering me viscerally. But a half an hour to 45 minutes later, where the fullness would be like, "Oh, here I am. Here, sorry. I just got here late." Kind of like, and I would resent that so much because it was like, why? I knew it, but I didn't feel it. So it didn't feel true. Like I knew this fullness was coming and every time it would happen like that. And I would pathologize that. It'd be like, if you know that you're eating that much food, how can you think you're not going to be full? It comes every time and every time you bypass it. But I want to, this comes up a lot in questions. And I think that comes from having come off of a period of restriction most of this time. Like that's more of that extreme hunger in more of the acute phases of a recovery from that, where that will not always be the case. Cause that doesn't happen to me now unless I'm super, super hungry, where I'll feel that fullness cue a lot later. But I think that's part of the reorganizing of hunger and fullness cues in general, and that there is this gap, and that's really a normal thing to happen. And I think that the body's doing that on purpose. The body's like, we need to get more food in, and then we're going to give you the cue. Otherwise, you'd stop sooner, potentially. And that's the body's actually asking for more food. And that does abate over time. That's something that those cues come closer over time. Although I will say that my fullness tends to lag a little bit still. It's not in real time the way I think it is for like my husband, where he'll feel that right away. But it's certainly not the way where I'm like, oh my gosh, I've just eaten so much food and now I'm so full. That's not happening anymore.
That's interesting because I don't think mine was actually that part restriction, a
No?
response to restriction. No, because there was the initial period where I did the hypnosis, hunger fullness thing, which was less than 3 weeks. It was like 2.5 weeks
Yeah.
of not even extreme restriction. So it was a very small amount of weight that I lost.
Okay.
And then this type of binging went on 9 months solid like this. So this is where I think that my biological hormonal issues must have been at play somehow, because I don't understand how, even now, how that period could have been so extreme. And then at 9 months, it tipped into bulimia. So then it's hard to say what would have been the compensatory stuff and what
Well,
might have been something else.
were you gaining weight
Yes.
during those?
Yes.
Okay. Again, this is just a theory I have. I think that extreme hunger is the body's way of gaining weight when it needs to, or when it's trying to whether it's compensatory or because the body will overshoot, right? So after some period of restriction, even if it's small and we lose, I mean, I've really heard stories and read studies on this where it's even a 5 to 10 pound weight loss will encourage the body to gain above and beyond, where it started, and that extreme hunger is the effort to do that. Because when there's weight stability, that doesn't tend to be happening. And I think maybe it's like, what's the chicken or the egg? But it seems like the body does that in instances where that weight gain is seemingly happening for a reason. Like it's a purposeful weight gain.
Mm-hmm. Unless there's a dysregulation going on.
Yes.
which I don't think is the case very often. It's hard, and it's one of those things that I have to sit with, as we spoke about on the lessons that we learn. I just have to sit with the not knowing and
Yeah.
just own it as my story. This is what it was. But this was the time when there was the night eating as well, and I'd be getting up at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning to keep eating. So it was very visceral. I went to see a therapist at this time, who I only saw once. And I walked in there, and for 50 minutes, I just cried, and this poured out of me, all this stuff about my eating and what was going on. It poured out, poured out. There was only one moment in the 50 minutes where she said anything, which was probably where I gave her a chance to say anything. Maybe it was about halfway through or something like that by my memory. And she said to me, "It sounds really visceral." That was the thing she said. And I think I was like, "Yeah," and then carried on. And then I got to the end, and we literally hadn't had a conversation at all. I just dropped all of this on this poor girl who was fairly newly qualified as well, and I think she just didn't know what to do with me. I didn't go back
Oh, I was
'cause
gonna
I
say,
didn't
did you see her again?
know, 'cause I hadn't made any kind of connection, and I don't blame her for that, but
Yeah, yeah.
it was that real kind of, but visceral was the word, and that was the first time I'd used the word visceral. And I remember hanging on to that intervention because it was kind of the only one I had for a long time.
Well, did you
Yeah.
feel when you left, were you feeling, well, what the heck was that for? Or were you like, that was good to get that out?
I don't think it felt good.
Mm,
I'm not sure I felt that sense of relief you sometimes get. I think I just walked out feeling a bit ashamed.
mm,
More ashamed, really.
right. So
Back
we
to
talk
fullness.
we like to meander.
We sure do.
If you're in a cycle of only fullness or of binging to the point where there is only the association of fullness with something that is negative or feels negative, what's to be done? How would someone listening to this in that position move forward?
I think this is a question for some people will really identify with the extreme hunger thing. That's most people's experience, I think, when you're living in that state of fullness. And then the fear is, right, how long is this extreme hunger going to last? I generally think that if you are not fighting with the hunger, I think when we get in a fight with ourselves about it, we keep triggering off that sense of deprivation's coming or we shouldn't and all of that. And I know that that's difficult. I don't want to scare people into thinking if there's any resistance to that, that they are going to keep triggering it. But I think there is something to coming back to. Well, it's making me think of you actually when you said you gave yourself a year. You gave almost this safety boundary around it where you were saying, okay, I'm going to go with this and I'm going to trust this. But if after a year I don't feel like it's working, I can reassess. So I think there might be something about this regular reassessment to try and understand, is this changing in any way or is this a very set pattern? I also think that maybe for some people, trauma might be at play here as well.
Yeah.
There's a trauma response happening because food can help with trauma in two seemingly opposite ways. You can fill yourself up with food, and that can kind of ground you in the present. When your body is feeling a certain way, our bodies exist in time. And if you have something like PTSD or trauma that takes you out of the present moment, that fullness, I think, can bring you back.
Mm-hmm.
So for anybody that might be the case, I think go listen to our episode on trauma. That would probably be the place I would direct people who might be struggling with that. But also food can help you escape the moment as well.
Right.
So it can ground us and help us escape it. But I think when we're really experiencing fullness, I don't know, I was about to say fullness pulls us into the moment, but not necessarily. It could be that it's,
Could do either.
yeah. And from an emotional perspective, if you've got panic, I know people who fill themselves up to avoid that panicked feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. It's probably another case of roller coaster. It's like whatever you need it for, that's what it'll do. It can bring you into the moment. It can also, if you're focused on more of the reward part of it, it can numb you out from the pain. Or maybe our bodies just work differently and it does different things for different people. But certainly I think there's different ways I could go. And for anyone who's interested, the trauma episode is episode 57, because I think it's a really highly relevant part of the discussion, especially where nothing else is making sense. You know, sometimes it's deeper than that. But also, I mean, I think there's also room in the conversation for those who don't necessarily binge, and it's not a matter of I'm feeling that type of fullness, but just fullness in general, even a little bit, like satisfaction, even where that's a fear, especially if someone's come from a restrictive place or is more a restrictor. And fullness is a sign of failure, which is more what we were talking about in the beginning, where like hunger is the barometer of success and prestige, right? Like the hungrier I am, the more I know I'm restricting, and that giving the high, that being its own reward and the learned. I think that there is actually a high that can come from restriction and hunger, and then fullness is like, oh my gosh, I've done something wrong, and just a little bit of that. It doesn't even have to be extreme, and that's more. I think that's belief rewiring. I mean, and visceral, but I think it comes originally from a belief that fullness means I'm gaining weight. Fullness means that I've given myself something that I don't deserve. Again, looking at the beliefs like we did in the last episode, if I am full, it means what? What is the belief about it?
And I think change almost requires throwing yourself into that dissonance, because I think you're right with the belief stuff. Quite often that's where it needs to start, because that's the first part that we can look at and decide what it is we need to believe or how we might want to change our beliefs. But your visceral isn't going to catch up straight away. So it's being able to tolerate, I guess, that place where you are coming back to and reinforcing this idea of, can I make friends with my fullness? Can I find ways to enjoy fullness if that's not too far of a push?
Mm.
Even though my body is telling me otherwise when it's feeling full, because it's used to feeling a certain way when you feel full. So it's so associated, fullness is associated with unpleasant feelings that might come along with that.
Yeah. I think it might be helpful to identify too, what are the behaviors I'm after rather than the feeling? Because like to your point, if your feelings aren't catching up to the logic, to what you are trying to get to from a belief point of view, then it might be helpful to say, what are the behaviors that would help me move forward in this? And that might be, um, eating X, Y, and Z and feeling full without compensation, or allowing myself to get to a 6 on the hunger fullness scale. Sort of making it something concrete that you're like, okay, I've done that thing, and now I'm expecting to feel this dissonance about it, but I have done that thing, and that thing is meant to help me.
Yeah, and on the belief front, I've said it in similar ways before, but sometimes it's just about doubting what you already believe, even if you're not ready to adopt a new belief system at this stage. All those things that you believe about fullness, what if they're not true? What if you experience them because you believe it, as opposed to this is your experience and that tells you that whatever it is that you're believing is true?
Yeah. Which might involve a shift in identity, because if the belief was being hungry makes me, it gives me prestige, that might have felt true in a version of you whose values were around being the smallest version of yourself you could be. And if those values are changing, then it's going to involve adopting a different, like what this now means has changed. So yes, it means that in that value system, but what do you want it to mean in this value system?
Mm. And also checking in and casting your mind back to, how are people talking about fullness when you were growing up? How are people talking about fullness now? I have a friend that I remember we went away once, and I think we'd gone and had fish and chips or something like that. And she had felt really full afterwards and was really distressed about it. Like um it's quite difficult for me to witness because I'm a friend. I'm not, and she's certainly not asking for my advice in terms of my professional advice. I don't think she would have appreciated me giving any. But seeing other people stressing out about their fullness and all the judgments that get spoken about and in diet culture and all of that, having a little look there, because a lot of the time we've adopted these beliefs. These are not things we've decided for ourselves. Do you have any memories of how people spoke about fullness when you were growing up?
Positively. I'm immediately, my grandparents come to mind, and like those Sunday dinners with my grandparents, and my grandma would always say, fill up, fill up. She was so happy to give me food to fill my belly.
Mm.
So that was a positive thing. It was, and my, my grandpa would just sit there with his chuckle. He would just watch me eat and go, like, he was like your quintessential grandpa. And he just loved, food was love to them. And the joy of eating it together was a good thing. So filling up was, and not, I didn't feel it was pushed. I do not have any I don't remember feeling that way at all. It was really just fill your belly, and that was like, okay, like it was fine at that time. I
Mhm.
can't remember. I don't think it was really a concept that my parents talked about.
Yeah, same. But I'm guessing there are people listening who may have been scolded because people around perceived that they were eating too much. And that comes to this idea that this sensation of fullness means I've eaten too much.
Yeah.
And that sense of wrongness for it might come from a very young
Yeah.
place.
Yes, that it's morally reprehensible or you've
Yeah.
done something wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to that regard, having a listen at the last episode where we talk a little bit more about those more subconscious associations and the beliefs of the body versus the mind.
Hmm.
Um, as far as the diet culture beliefs too, sometimes I think that fullness, it's like, oh, I've overeaten, like this is the sign that I've overeaten. And it's kind of like, did you though? Is fullness a sign that you've eaten too much, or is it a sign that you're satiated? You know what I mean? And redefining what fullness really does mean. I think that sometimes we automatically assume diet culture will have us assume that fullness means you've gone past the point where you should have, when really you can reconstruct that as I have hit the point where now I'm done.
We are supposed to be full or get full.
Yeah.
Maybe not full all the time, but we're supposed to get full. I think that's
Yeah.
how the mechanism is designed.
Right. Right.
I
Like it
also,
exactly. Go
and
ahead. Sorry. I
isn't,
just got really passionate.
no, I love it. Bring it on. The hungrier you are, for me anyway, the hungrier I am, sometimes the more uncomfortable the fullness can be. It's almost like my stomach is just like emptied. So it's all, and I'm trying to like, I'm trying to gesture with my hands what an empty stomach looks like. I don't know what an empty stomach looks like. But then you eat and it's like suddenly everything's stretched and the stretch receptors are sending signals up. And so I think sometimes the hungrier I am, to go from hungry to very full, that experience can be more uncomfortable when I'm more hungry, particularly if I'm not paying attention. I mean, last
Mm,
week I shared the example with spaghetti bolognese, and what I was expecting was to have that experience. Oh, I'm really hungry. So I'm going to feel really full and it's going to be uncomfortable. And it wasn't. But I think a lot of the time, if I get to very hungry and then I eat, the fullness feels big and more uncomfortable. If fullness feels uncomfortable, does that mean we're too full? If it's uncomfortable, should it be to a level of comfort? And how do
mm.
we, like, what
Well,
does our mind say about that?
yeah. I think it's contextual, right? Because is it coming from the overhunger that it started with? I think it's just either way. It's like making peace with what happened. You know what I mean? It's like this is what it is now, and it's not shaming around that. Whether it was because we had too much or because we were too hungry when we started. And the other conversation that comes up around this is there is a fear of fullness because there's a belief that you'll stretch out your stomach, and then you're going to always need more food. Do you get that question? I get that all the time.
I think I've heard that idea. I'm not sure that I have it as a question very often.
No, I get it like weekly. Like, what aren't I going to stretch my stomach out with like by filling, with my binge or even just overeating? Isn't that going to trick my body into thinking or stretch my stomach out so my body now needs more food to get full? Like, and my response to that is again, I have to say, I don't know scientifically, to be honest, but I really think that our bodies are not like, I just trust it. Like, I don't think that our bodies are so not adapted to that. And in my own experience, I have absolutely stretched my stomach out beyond fullness. And it hasn't had this detrimental effect of now my body doesn't understand that, like as if it's a piece of cheap cotton that it just stretches out and now it never goes back. You know what I mean? I think our bodies are a lot more built for that,
Yes.
and that it'll work itself out in the end. I don't think we need to micromanage that process.
Yes, agreed. When I think about it and I think how big some of my binges have been, I must have in those moments stretched my stomach to. There were times where I thought, can you actually? I think I remember Googling it, like whether you can rupture your stomach. I mean, apparently you
Yeah.
can. And I remember thinking that that was a very, very real possibility. But I don't think that that's had a lasting impact. One thing that we do know, and we do know this from a scientific perspective, is that with restriction, there's something called delayed emptying that can happen, where the stomach holds the food for longer compared to somebody perhaps who's not restricting. So this is quite often why people who have a greater history of restriction may feel more uncomfortably full. The stomach doesn't release the food as quickly. And that can make kind of the refeeding part quite challenging as well.
Yeah.
And the problem is with stopping before you're full is you're just going to be hungrier again. And that's what I found when I was always trying to do this hunger
Yes.
fullness thing. And I treated intuitive eating like that for the longest time as well. I thought, oh, it's this hunger fullness thing. And that sounds like it makes so much sense to me. But I wasn't really thinking that I should, in my mind, be as full as actually I need to be in order
Right.
to see me through. We're supposed to eat more than we need in the
Right.
moment to see us through to the next time that we eat. So now when I feel full, I'm like, oh, that's going to keep me going.
Yeah.
And that's genuinely the thought. And I know some people might feel so far away from that. I didn't think it would be possible to not think something different about that, but
Here we are.
change. It can change. And you can change. Not that you're not okay as you are, because you are. But you can change these things. Yeah.
Well, I hope that was helpful. If we didn't hit on something, let us know.
Yeah.
We've got a whole bunch of new listeners out here. And if you've missed our earlier episodes, we love ratings and reviews because they really help the podcast get shown to more people who need to hear it. And if you would be so kind, we would really appreciate scrolling down wherever you listen to podcasts and you can fill out a little nice ladies worth a listen, 5 stars.
Exactly. We've written it for you, so you don't even have to think. We really, really do appreciate it. I know we say that. Everyone says that. I don't know how to ask for it in a really exciting way that people listen. They go, oh, no, I must do that. That's what I want to do.
You know, it's like when you know why, because it really does help us. It really does help the podcast get seen and reach more people. Honestly, that's why, because podcast platform sites love when podcasts have reviews. So they bump them up.
Exactly.
That's why.
I
know why I'll do most things.
Yeah.
If I like it.
But you won't give it 5 stars. I'll edit this out because I don't want to encourage people. So you'll never give them 5 stars anyway. So how can you expect people to give you 5 stars? Huh?
Well, when it's a 5-point scale, it's more of on a 10-point scale. I won't give a 10. Like I won't give 10.
You will give 5.
I think I'm more likely to give 5 because it's like it's more of a gradient.
I feel like you dodged whether you would. It's more likely.
It is more. It's not. No, it's just that sometimes I wouldn't. But I'm more likely in a 5-point rating scale than definitely not in a 10 point, unless I love it.
Is there anything that you would give 10 stars to?
Spaghetti bolognese and Life After Diets podcast.
Yeah. If you could give 10 stars, you would.
Yeah, I would. Goes without saying.
I think we've labored the point about reviews. So thanks. If you stay to the bitter end of us going on about reviews for the last 3 minutes,
thank you.
Thank you.
Join us next week for our podcast episode on ratings and reviews.
Yeah.